Story of the Exodus. A lot of you probably know parts of this story. This is the story of Moses. This is the story of the Pharaoh in Egypt who got worried because those enslaved Hebrew people kept having babies. And the Pharaoh was worried that if they kept having babies, they would outnumber the Egyptians, and they might rise up and not want to be enslaved anymore. Sound familiar? And so the Pharaoh decided that he told the midwives that they were responsible for killing all of the boy babies. He said, if it's a girl, you can let them live. If it's a boy, you have to kill them. Well, Shiphrah and Puah, the midwives, they weren't really fond of this idea. They weren't crazy about it, and so they didn't. And when Pharaoh said, hey, I'm noticing that all these boys are being born, there are babies, and Shiphrah and Puah said, well, those Hebrew women, they're just so strong, they just give birth to the babies before we even get there, and then what can we do, And so during this time and after this time, Moses' mother gave birth to a son that she named Moses, and she built a basket of reeds and put her baby in it and put him in the river. And Pharaoh's daughter was bathing with some attendants of hers, and she saw this basket with this baby in it. And she pulled it out and she said, oh, this must be one of the Hebrew babies, but it's awfully cute, don't you think? And Moses' sister was standing there, and she came up to the Pharaoh's daughter and said, would you like me to find you a wet nurse? And Pharaoh's daughter said, yes, please. And so Moses' sister went and got Moses' birth mother and brought her to Pharaoh's daughter, and she nursed her own baby. I'm going to skip ahead because it's a long story. But eventually God told Moses that he needed to go and set his people free. And Moses said, I am really not your guy. I've got kind of a stutter, you might have noticed. I'm not a good speaker. And God said, it's your job. You got to go do this. And Moses said, but how in the world are they going to know? How is he going to believe me? And God said, you see that staff in your hand? He said, throw it to the ground. And Moses threw his staff to the ground, and it turned into a snake. And God said, now grab that snake by the tail. And he grabbed the snake by the tail, and he picked it up, and it turned back into a staff. And God said, that'll probably help. That'll help your case. So Moses went to Pharaoh and said, God says that you really need to let the Hebrew people go. It is not right that they should be enslaved. You need to let them go. And here's a really interesting, and Pharaoh at first said no. And Moses said, well, God is going to send some plagues your way. And the first plague was that the river Nile turned into blood. And so nobody could get their drinking water. All the fish died. It smelled really bad. And Moses went to Pharaoh and said, you got to let my people go now. And here's a part that I find really interesting. It says in the scripture that God hardened Pharaoh's heart. And so Pharaoh said no. And they went through this another 9 times. God sent frogs. God sent lice. God sent a disease that killed all of the livestock. God sent wild beasts that ran around and ate all of the food that was left. God sent boils on all the beasts and the people. God sent hail that crushed everything. God sent darkness for 3 whole days, and every time Pharaoh said, they can go, and then God hardened his heart and he said, nope, not going. You have to still be slaves. And then God pulled out the big guns. God said, okay, mostly I've been attacking your crops and your animals so far. Things have been irritating. Now we're doing the big guns. And God told all of the God told all of the Hebrew people, okay, I'm going to send a plague that is going to kill the firstborn of everything, including the people. But you will be protected. Your families need to go and sacrifice a ram or a sheep, a young yearling male. You need to eat it all. You need to roast it and eat it all. But first, you need to take the blood and paint it over your doorways. And if you do this, you will be okay. And so the Hebrew people, they painted the blood from those animals on their doorways. And that night, the angel of death came and killed the firstborn of all of the families. But the angel of death passed over all of those houses that had the blood painted on their doorways. That is why this celebration is called Passover, because the angel passed over the Hebrew houses. So after that, Pharaoh was pretty done. And Pharaoh said, okay, fine, just go. But the Jews knew that they did not have time to pack for this journey. Pharaoh had changed his mind 10 times before, and they didn't have a lot of faith that he wasn't going to do it again. And so they didn't wait for the bread to rise. They baked the flour and water into crackers and grabbed what they could carry and ran away fast. And it was good that they did so, because what do you think happened then? Do you think Pharaoh just let them go? No, Pharaoh sent his army after the fleeing Hebrews. They ran to the Red Sea. They said, God, what are we going to do? We're trapped between an army and water. And God said to Moses, hit the ground with your staff. And he did, and the water parted. And the Hebrew people ran through as the water is up on both sides of them. They got through. Pharaoh's army came behind them. Once the Hebrew people had gotten through, Moses hit the ground with his staff again, and Pharaoh's army was washed away as the water came back. That is the story of the Exodus. Now Jen Dadek is going to do her reflection.
What a hard act to follow. Good morning, everyone. I'm Jen Dadek, and I'm your worship associate today because I didn't go to the meeting and I got an email saying, guess what? You get to do this week. Which makes me look at this topic and go, I cannot be a minister. How in the world do you write a sermon on this? But anyways, the topic is freedom. I find it to be a really loaded word in our culture. I'm not sure about you, but whenever I hear the word freedom by a fellow American, I have this vision of a middle-aged, cisgendered, heterosexual white guy holding an oversized gun in his hand, a red MAGA hat on his head, standing right in front of a business that has a sign at the door that says masks required, bellowing that sacred American word with a tone and volume that Mel Gibson's William Wallace would be envious of. It's not a pretty picture. I think if you ask many of us as Americans what freedom means, they'll say something like freedom from tyranny, freedom to do what I like, when I like, without anybody telling me different. There's also a tendency to subconsciously include freedom from the consequences from doing what they like when they like. I find that many of us want freedom but are also unwilling to pay the price or carry the responsibility of that freedom. But moving beyond over-the-top stereotypes, what is freedom? I went looking for inspiration and found that Time magazine said that we tend to think of freedom as an emancipatory ideal. Ooh, I like that. And I think that definition underlies this really obnoxious stereotype. The idea that our freedom is blocked by a bigger power and is pushing their will down upon us. We can apply this idea to the Revolutionary War, the Civil Rights Movement, the justice movement, even to these countries in the Caribbean like Barbados that are saying we want to leave the Commonwealth and we want to be in charge of ourselves and become republics. People as a whole tend to want to have input on what affects them, their families, and their communities. I think we can all kind of agree on these big political freedoms. Yet, what about the quieter freedoms? What about freedom from hunger? Freedom from having to worry where you're going to sleep at night? The freedom to move about safely in your own neighborhood? What about the freedom to pray? Or even freedom to think? While researching this topic, I stumbled across something called the 5 Freedoms of Animal Welfare. According to American Humane, an organization dedicated to the safety, welfare, and well-being of animals, the 5 freedoms are globally recognized as the gold standard of animal welfare, encompassing both the mental and physical well-being of animals. They include freedom from hunger and thirst, freedom from discomfort, freedom from pain, injury, and disease, and freedom to express normal and natural behavior. Wow. What would our world be like if those freedoms were granted to our citizens and others around the world? How much worry and stress of our lives would be eliminated? And what could we accomplish, both as individuals and as humanity as a whole, if we had those freedoms? I've been mulling this idea of freedom all week long, trying to figure out how this loud freedom of emancipation and self-determination coincides with the quieter freedoms of mind, body, and spirit. How can they intertwine safely? Because too much of one can stomp down on the other and prevent freedom from existing. I was getting nowhere, and I was getting a little frustrated. And then on Friday afternoon, I took my daughter, Ellie, to a small mosque in Lake Oswego for their weekly services. Ellie has an assignment for school where she needs to attend a weekly service of all 3 of the Abrahamic faiths and write about her impressions. We were warmly greeted, shown where to put our shoes, and taken inside. A young woman named Jasmine sat next to us and answered all of Ellie's questions with grace and warmth. During the service, the men and women were separated into 2 different areas, and there was a tall curtain between them. We couldn't see anything, not the imam or the men, period. It was completely cut off. I watched small boys wander back and forth to get hugs from their mama and then wander back to the men's side. I watched 3 little girls play quietly together. They were playing doctor. It was really cute. They were giving each other vaccines. It was too cute. But their mamas were sitting on the floor listening to them, just letting them be while they listened to the sermon and said their prayers. And as I sat there listening to these prayers that were sung in Arabic, which was beautiful, I realized I was witnessing both of those freedoms at the same time. I feel that being able to practice one's religion definitely falls under that emancipatory freedom, and yet it was also a lovely example of the freedom to think, the freedom to believe, and the freedom to follow one's heart. As I am disgusted by the overly jingoistic, over-the-top stereotype of American freedom, I think I've gained a smidge of appreciation for its magnitude. I think it's somewhat necessary, because I think its sheer enormity clears the space like a forest fire so that it can be filled with the quieter, everyday little freedoms. And I hope we continue to attempt to find balance between these two.
Every year, my daughters, if they are home, and I go to our dear friends Tom and Rivka Gewurtz's home to celebrate Passover. Every year, we sit around the table and tell the story of the Hebrew people and how God brought them out of slavery in Egypt. We begin by lighting the Shabbat candles because the first night of Passover is also on Shabbat. We say the blessings of Pesach and the blessings over the wine. We ceremonially wash our hands. Someone hides the afikomen, which is a piece of matzah that the children find later at the end and we all save for dessert. We talk about the plagues, naming them as we dip our finger in wine and spill it onto our plate. We drink 4 small glasses of wine or grape juice. We dip bitter herbs, which are usually parsley at our table, in salt water to represent the bitterness and tears of slavery. 4 children, or 1 child, or the youngest person present, asks 4 questions. In Judaism, children are actively engaged in learning about the holidays and rituals of Jewish life. Children go to temple with their parents, and the questions are used to encourage kids to be inquisitive and to take part in the story. On every other night, we sit upright. Why do we lean on pillows tonight? Because we were slaves, and now we are free, and so we get to relax. We eat a Hillel sandwich of matzah, which is cracker-like unleavened bread with a little horseradish and a big scoop of charoset, which is a chunky paste of apples and walnuts and honey and cinnamon that represents the mortar of the bricks that the Hebrew slaves built in Egypt. We sing Dayenu, it would have been enough. Dayenu, 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 Dayenu. And we talk about what it is that's enslaving us now. What can we get stuck to or bound to or enslaved by? And how can we continue to get free? It's a couple of hours of history and thoughtfulness, ritual and gratitude. Each community, sometimes each family, has their own slightly different way of doing the Seder. Many, many editions of the Haggadah exist, which is the script for the ritual. But the fundamental purpose of it all is to remind the Jewish people that once we were enslaved and that God chose us to be his people and set us free from slavery. In the story of the Exodus, there is so much to unpack. Moses didn't want to be the chosen one. How many of us don't want that role sometimes? Some of us don't want paper plates to spill on us. Why did God harden Pharaoh's heart so many times? Was God just showing off? Why did he make things so much harder? Is that just rhetoric? What an extraordinary price to have paid. But the part of the story that rarely gets talked about, that I'm really curious about today, comes at the end of the story that I told you during Time for All Ages, I told you how they made it through the Red Sea and the waters came in and drowned Pharaoh's army. But what I didn't tell you is that what comes next in the story is that the Hebrew people wandered in the desert for 40 years. 40 years. At first, they were hungry and thirsty and complained to Moses, "Why are we in the desert and there's nothing to eat or drink?" And so Moses made water come out of a rock with God's help. And then God provided them with manna, a fine, sweet substance that arrived on the ground every morning. Everyone went and gathered enough for their family's needs every morning, but if you tried to save some, it went bad overnight. It got bugs in it. Except on Friday morning, where you gathered enough for your family for 2 nights because you weren't supposed to work on the Sabbath. The Sabbath, you got to rest. But you couldn't keep it any longer. You couldn't save anything to get ahead. Did it really take 40 years for the Hebrews to learn how to be free after a lifetime of slavery? What skills does one need to learn to get free? How long could it possibly take? Well, my friends, sometimes I think it takes us a lot longer than we think to learn how to be free. We have to give up old ways of being, ways that might not serve us especially well, but ways that we are so used to that we don't even see them. There's a David Foster Wallace quote that speaks to this. He wrote, "There are these 2 young fish swimming along, and they happen to meet an older fish swimming the other way, who nods at them and says, 'Morning, boys. How's the water?' And the 2 young fish swim on for a bit, and then eventually one of them looks over to the other one and he said, 'What the hell is water?'" The idea that we don't see the water we swim in is used in lots of different places. Corporate cultures, for one, but it's also used to describe the culture of white supremacy. White people in America, and by this I specifically mean people who no longer identify as being from somewhere specific, Irish or Russian or Italian, but folks who just see themselves as white. We are really, really used to seeing things that center us as normal. Ketanji Brown Jackson was just confirmed to be a Supreme Court justice, and that is fabulous and amazing. But it's important to note that of the 115 people who have so far been on that court, only 8 of them have not been white men. Our presidents have all been white men, except one. 86% of Fortune 500 CEOs are still white men. My daughters, who grew up in Portland, had between the 2 of them 1 black teacher before they got to college. From who is in charge to flesh-colored Band-Aids, white is seen as the default. Everything else is seen as diversity. And the problem with this, the problem for everyone in this country, is that too many of us see that as normal. It's the water we swim in. There was a really interesting Twitter conversation recently that went a little viral. It started with Marco Rogers, a black man, who wrote, "Did you all know that white people don't have the cultural concept of real talk? You know, where you stop saying the diplomatic thing and just tell people what's really going on? They just don't have it. You try and have a moment of real talk, and they just freak out. It's one of the things that makes it hard for people of color, and black people especially, to form real trust relationships with white people. Y'all don't know what's going on because no one tells you. And no one tells you because you can't handle the truth. I've come to understand that white people have their own seemingly convoluted way of understanding what's really going on and what to do about it. But I have a hard time understanding these rituals, and I think a lot of people of color do too. Other folks agreed, while also pointing out that neurodiverse people also struggle with understanding all of the subtle, non-verbal communication white people employ as well. And then everyone was a little gobsmacked when Serenissima Lazor noted that white women are also tasked with keeping the peace and making sure that conflict doesn't happen. Suddenly, a big cultural clash was made a lot clearer. Marco Rogers noted that if white women are tasked with keeping the peace, it explains a lot about why blacks are so often intimidating or aggressive in their minds. Part of our difficulty in changing the culture is that so many times we don't really understand what the culture is. We don't understand that the unwritten ways of talking, like don't discuss politics at the dinner table, isn't how everyone does it. It may or may not be how we do it. But I bet if you think about it, your family has many unwritten rules that you don't have to think about. And you don't think to tell someone new to the family about because they're just normal to you. It is not an easy thing to figure out how to look at the world differently. Maybe that's why the Hebrew people spent 40 years in the desert trying to figure it out. It's not easy to leave all that is familiar behind. It's painful, even if what we're going to is better. I bet that we would all say that we want a world that is more free and more just for everyone. But the problem is that that requires change, and change is hard. We fear change. If you grew up trusting the police, the idea of changing the whole system is terrifying. Who's going to keep the peace? But if the police shot your unarmed black son, you might be thinking that there has got to be a better way than this. Maybe not every interaction with a civilian calls for someone carrying a gun. As Unitarian Universalists, we see the need for justice. We don't believe that all the people sleeping outside are there just because they didn't work hard enough. We don't believe that all the folks killed by police officers deserve to be shot. We know better than that. But we are still sometimes stuck on how to get free. Not just how to rescue other people and make them just like us, because that's not freedom. We are aiming for liberation for everyone, as long as your liberation doesn't harm anyone else. But freedom and liberation are hard because they require change. Rebecca Solnit is a brilliant feminist author who writes nonfiction books and essays and is a public intellectual. She's a white woman who, among other things, is credited with developing the word mansplaining, thanks to her essay, Men Explain Things to Me. She writes of hope and revolution in a way that I find inspiring. In her book, Hope in the Dark, Untold Histories, Wild Possibilities, she writes, to hope is to gamble. It's to bet on your futures, on your desires, on the possibility that an open heart and uncertainty is better than gloom and safety. To hope is dangerous, and yet it is the opposite of fear, for to live is to risk. The Hebrew people, like African Americans during the Civil War, knew that freedom wouldn't be easy, but that there was no alternative. The possibility or probability of hardship as a free person was still preferable to being enslaved. Of course it was. They gambled that whatever happened next had to be better than slavery. The stakes for those of us in this room are far less dramatic. Of course they are. Most of us have it pretty good. We all have some ability to make our own choices. But we are still stuck in a world that is brutal to many. The news out of Ukraine is a painful reminder that even as a free person, some people don't have any good choices. But as Rebecca Solnit says, hope is the idea that we can change things. Hope is the realization that we don't know the future, and therefore it is ours to change and mold. Chris Smalls from New York City knows something about changing and molding the future. Together with 3 other co-workers, all 4 are Black men, they did something no one has ever been able to do so far. They got a union in the Amazon warehouse on Staten Island. Amazon has spent $4.3 million in the last year to defeat union initiatives in their warehouses and other job locations. Amazon employs almost 1 million people in the United States and 1.3 million worldwide. Their business model involves rapid turnover of employees. They actively prefer that folks stay less than 2 years. They hire almost anyone who applies and then supervise them by a process of electronic monitoring. Have a bathroom emergency and don't make your quota a couple of times? You're out. They have a big problem with firing people who called out sick because the system doesn't always register it, and no one actually checks to see that when the system sends you a notice saying you're fired, that they hadn't called in sick. Big unions have tried to organize Amazon workers for years, but have been unsuccessful. Conventional wisdom says this time it worked because these folks worked in the warehouse and took the time to build relationships. Moses never got to see the promised land. After leading his people, God punished him for some slight by not allowing him to see the fruits of his labor. We too may never get to see what real liberation looks like. We may spend more than 40 years wandering in the metaphorical desert. But in a world where everyone is free from the burdens of patriarchal white supremacy, that's worth fighting for. Rebecca Solnit says hope just means another world might be possible. It's not promised, not guaranteed. Hope calls for action, and action is impossible without hope. I invite you, my friends, to a world of hope. May it be so. Blessed be, and amen.